Hey, welcome back, this is Sid. Just like sound frequencies which are easy to identify with the bass, mid and treble controls, a digital image can also be split into a high and a low frequency layer. But wouldn't it be great if you could control the midtones like in a 3 or 5 band equalizer? Well, in this video we are going to see how exactly the mid frequencies of an image look like and what control they offer. For those who want to jump right into the new technique, you can check the timestamps below, but make it a point to watch the entire explanation later, as many fine details have probably never been covered. And that's why frequency separation is one of the most misused technique in Photoshop. So it is very important to truly understand the concept behind frequency separation, the way it was used in the past, the present, and then we move to the future. But before we even get into that, have you ever wondered what the term frequency actually means in an image? Because in general, the term frequency is always related to time. And the usual explanation of frequency is using this graph of high speed oscillations versus low speed oscillations to depict the high and low frequency. And all that is sort of correct, but think about it. Our image has nothing to do with time or speed. A photograph is a still image. It is absolutely static, right? So for digital images, frequency here refers to spatial distribution of pixels, meaning it is how the contrasting pixels are distributed in a given space of the image. So, the low spatial frequency is filled with the low contrast tonal values and color information depicting the shape or three-dimensional form of the image. And the high spatial frequency, on the other hand, is filled with extremely high contrast color and tone information, which forms the fine details or texture of the image. Also, if you notice, on the high frequency layer, you will find all this color information around the highlights. This tells us that there are some upper middle frequencies that ended up here as well. And this is important to remember while retouching. But I'll get to that later. In the last medium format and film look video, I've used one version of frequency separation called Deconvolution Sharpening. And if you haven't watched the video or downloaded that free action, you will absolutely be amazed how tack sharp your regular DSLR image transforms into. So definitely check it out. And in the same video, I talked about how RAW converters use a deconvolution algorithm to decode the sharpness from a RAW file. But since this is done by RAW converters using their algorithms before displaying the final image on screen, the user doesn't have any control on this default base sharpening. So, to replicate deconvolution sharpening and take control of the parameters in Photoshop resulted in the first frequency separation technique. And this was done using the high pass filter. So Photoshop comes with built-in high and low frequency filters. The built-in high frequency filter is the high pass filter, and the built-in low frequency filter is the Gaussian blur filter. And they are exactly opposite of each other. To separate spatial frequencies with the high pass technique, we need to create two duplicate layers. The top layer will contain our high frequency image data, and the bottom layer will be our low frequency layer. So let's select the high frequency layer, then go to Filter, Other, and High Pass. Now slowly move the radius slider from 0.1 to higher. Our goal is to get the right amount of fine details without halos, and that would be the number to select. Then looks detailed enough for this image. And make sure to remember this number, and then click OK. Now let's turn the visibility of the high frequency layer off and select the bottom low frequency layer. And then go to Filter, Blur and Gaussian Blur. And then apply the exact same 10 pixel radius that we had just selected in the high pass filter. So let's click OK and turn the visibility of the high frequency layer back on. Next, I'm going to change the high frequency layer's blending mode to linear light and reduce the opacity exactly to 50%. I'll tell you why in a minute. And what this will give you is the same image separated in high and low spatial frequencies. Now to check how accurate is this separation, let's create a duplicate of the original and drag it to the top. And change the blend mode to difference. The difference blend mode will show you how accurate the frequency separated image is compared to the original image. If it is completely black, then there is no difference. But to check it even more accurately, let's take a look at the histogram. You can see that the mean is 0.08 and the standard deviation is 0.79, which is pretty good. Ideally, if there is no difference, like if I compare it with the original image layer, the mean, which represents the average value, should be 0. And the standard deviation, which represents how widely intensity values vary, should also be 0. But let's change the opacity of linear light back to 100. And now if I switch to the overlay blend mode, which was in fact the original blend mode used for this technique, and go back to the histogram to see the difference, you can see the mean and standard deviation have gone substantially higher. The mean is around 2.5 and standard deviation is 3.55. So that's why for balanced separation, we now use linear light at 50% opacity. And if you want to learn how to use histograms properly, make sure to check out this video. Now before we move on to the next technique, let me show you a few things. If I turn off the blur or low frequency layer, the image becomes sharp. This is where the high pass sharpening technique comes from. And if I invert this high pass layer by pressing Ctrl or Command I get Gaussian blur, because high pass and Gaussian blur are opposites, right? This method is used in the inverted high pass technique for fixing blotchy skin color, like in the lips here. And the next step is where the magic happens. Have a look. As soon as I apply Gaussian blur to it, I'm adding texture back into the image. So this happens because when we apply blur on a layer with inverted frequency, the low frequency becomes the opposite, that is the high frequency, which is sharpness, and this brings back the sharpness and the texture. Now I can create a mask and paint in the areas I want. Now moving on. Since the first frequency separation technique was originally developed with sharpening in mind, the goal of deconvolution is to recreate the exact identical image as it existed before the separation took place. And with the original high pass plus Gaussian blur method, which initially used the overlay blend mode at 100% opacity, we got an imprecise final image with a higher difference as we saw in the histogram. So the quest for a precise frequency separation led to an alternative technique using apply image. And this method begins the same way, where you duplicate the original background layer twice. The top layer is for the high frequency and the bottom duplicate is for the low frequency. From here, the steps change, and I'll explain it as we go. Keep in mind that all this time we've been working on an 8-bit image. This is important because the steps will change again for 16-bit. And if you want to know the difference between 8 and 16-bit, make sure to check out this bit depth video. Right now, we're still working on an 8-bit image. So I'm going to turn off the visibility of the high frequency layer and select the low frequency layer. Next, go to Filter, Blur, and Gaussian blur. So when we blur, we should only do it till the texture we want to keep disappears. Now pay attention as this part is very important. The apply image technique makes very accurate separation and it will automatically calculate the high frequency in the next step. So the amount of texture we are going to remove here is the exact same amount of texture that will resurface and end up in our texture layer. So whatever pixels that we set for the blur in the low frequency, for example 10 pixels, that 1 to 10 pixel will end up in the high layer, and all the pixels beyond the 10 pixel radius will form the low frequency layer. So basically, you're splitting the image at 10 pixel radius, and you can do that with 5 or 30 pixel depending on your image. So to isolate the texture, choose a pixel radius with which all the fine details will be blurred. Now let's select and turn on the high frequency layer's visibility and go to image and apply image. Now this part may look overly complicated, but I promise it is really very interesting and straightforward once you understand the logic behind it. So let's think about it this way. What does apply image do? Like the name suggests, it applies an image. Now where is the image being applied to? The current active layer that we selected right before clicking on apply image is our target layer. And what image does it apply from? Or what is the source? It could be either from a different document which is currently open, or from any layer within the same active document. So now, which image are we applying to our selected high frequency layer? The image of the low frequency layer, right? So in the layer dialog, select low. Now, what is the point of applying the image? Meaning, what exactly are we trying to do here? The difference between the original copy on the high layer and this blurred low layer will give you the final texture layer, which will be applied on the high layer. So to get the difference between the original layer and the blur layer to result in the texture layer, we will need to subtract, right? And that's what we will do in the blending option by choosing subtract. The blending option by default is usually set on multiply, and that's why the image looks crazy whenever you open apply image. Now the scale can be set either to 1 or 2, and since we want to subtract everything, we need to set it to the maximum, that is 2. Next is the offset, which we will set to 128. If you hear the value 128 in Photoshop and it doesn't ring a bell, please watch the color theory video and also the bit depth video. I'll link them in the description below. So 128 is the value of neutral gray in Photoshop. For an 8-bit image which has 256 shades starting from 0, which is black, think of it as having absolutely no light or a dark empty space, and 255 on the other hand is white with the maximum brightest value, and 128, which is in the middle, is the value of mid neutral gray. And there is a reason why we are setting this offset to neutral gray. Because when we set the blending to subtract, what it does is it subtracts the blurred color and tone values, that is the low frequency, making it look gray, and all that is left behind on the selected layer is the details or the texture. And the reason why we want the subtracted area to be gray is because with one of the contrast group of blend modes like overlay, vivid light or linear light, we can turn the neutral gray pixels to be transparent without affecting the lighter and darker pixels which form the texture. And this might look just like the high pass filter layer, but the main difference is that this is exactly the same texture information we subtracted from the blur layer below, automatically calculated for us with the exact radius. The preserve transparency, mask and the invert checkbox should not be checked. The channel here will remain RGB, which is the combined look of the layer. If you want to see examples of applying a channel as an image, definitely check out the luminosity masking video, where I show you how to create luminosity mask using apply image. Now let's click OK and change the blending mode of the high frequency layer to linear light, and your overall image will look exactly as it did before you started the separation. Now to check the accuracy, let's create a duplicate of the original and see the difference using the difference blend mode. And when you refresh and check the histogram, the mean is 0.49 and the standard deviation is 0.50. So it's quite similar to the high pass separation with linear light blend mode at 50%. But compared to the high pass separation with overlay blend mode, it is a lot more accurate. But it's still not a perfect split. Now let's move on to this version of the image, which is in 16 bits. When working in 16-bit mode, the subtract method does not give visibly accurate or even separation. This is because the 128 offset value we applied, which is the neutral gray value in 8-bit images, is not the middle value in a 16-bit image. Because a 16-bit image has a lot more than the 256 shades of an 8-bit image. Take a look at this info panel in Photoshop. You can see that the RGB has 256 RGB values per channel. Now when I change the bit depth to 16-bit scale here, it shows 32,769 RGB values per channel, starting from 0 up to 32,768. Now since 32,768 is an even number, we can divide it by 2 to get an actual middle point at 16,384. Let me give you a quick example that will let you actually see why we use these different settings. If I create a gray color of middle value 128 in each channel red, green and blue, I get a neutral gray color, right? And if I select the eyedropper tool and click on the gray color, look at the 8-bit RGB values. They're all 128. Now here's the interesting part. Watch what happens on the other side if I change the info settings to 16-bit RGB. We get a middle value of 16,448. But we already know that our 16-bit middle point in Photoshop is 16,384. That means this same gray is not the neutral gray for 16-bit images. And that's why we need different settings in the apply image, and we cannot use the 128 gray offset setting for 16-bit image separation. So let's see how to do this on the 16-bit version of this image. Like before, we'll start with 2 copies of the image to be separated. And on the low layer, we'll apply the Gaussian blur filter and choose the radius just like we did with the 8-bit method. Now let's select the high layer and go to apply image. And in the source, we'll select the bottom low layer just like we did in the 8-bit method. Okay, this is where the steps change. Since we can't subtract like we did in the 8-bit method, we're going to do it in reverse by adding it. So the first thing we need to make sure is that invert is checked and then choose the add blend mode. So think about it. We are adding and then inverting it. So indirectly we are subtracting, right? Now you must be thinking, what benefit does the add blend mode have over subtract? Well, have a look. At 0 offset value, we are getting gray. This is because the add blend mode starts with a negative 255 value as black instead of 0, and the white is the same 255. And that's why the midpoint here is 0 and not 128. And this is perfect because it takes the actual midpoint of whatever bit depth the image may be in, and not a fixed 8-bit middle value of 128. So if your image is in 16 or 32 bits, its exact midpoint will be at 0. Now let's finish the 16-bit steps and see the difference with the original. So let's click OK and set the blend mode to linear light. Now to see the difference, let's duplicate the original layer and drag it to the top. Set the blend mode to difference and let's check the histogram. As you can see, the mean and standard deviation is 0. So the accuracy for this technique is the best by far. So you must be wondering, hey Sid, why don't you use this method for 8 bits then? Well, unfortunately, this technique is not valid while working in 8-bit mode, because 8 bits doesn't have a perfect middle gray as 16-bit does. Let me explain. Because an 8-bit image has 256 shades from 0 to 255, right? So if we set the blend mode to add and invert it, the middle 0 value should be calculated by the half of 255, that is 127.5 to be exact. But decimal values don't exist as bits, so instead, the computer takes a rounded 128 as a middle value. So the separation done in 8 bits will always be slightly uneven. I hope that makes sense. If not, I highly recommend you watch the bit depth video which covers the entire basics in just a few minutes. Now, with a perfect split possible in 16-bit images, sharpening was just one little thing you can do with this technique. The quest for sharpening opened up a Pandora's box. From this point on, there are various ways to retouch an image. The most interesting part of apply image technique will blow your mind. That is, it can be done with absolutely any type of blur filter you want. You can use surface blur, motion blur, spin blur, and even crazy ones like the oil paint filter. And when you apply this image and set the high layer to linear light, you get the original image back. This could be used to smooth out frizzy hair and then mask it out. Or you can even use negative settings of clarity and texture sliders from the camera raw filter and blur out the details in the low layer. Whichever blur filter you choose will give you a different type of control while retouching. Now that we have covered the basics of frequency separation, let's take it to the next level. The first technique I'm going to show you is by doing a triple separation of the image into high, low, and the mid frequency layer. I call it the frequency separation 3. And the way to do this starts with the basic separation. So the first split is the main separation and will create the high and the mid frequency layer. And you can choose any blur for this first step. So I'll choose a low radius setting around 10 pixels. Now let's select the high layer and go to apply image to apply the blurred layer with the subtract blend mode because this image is in 8 bits. So I'll click OK and change the blend mode to linear light and call this layer high. Now to do the second split, duplicate the blurred layer and call it mid, then go back to the original blur layer and call it low. Now let's add some more blur, and this time we have to be very specific. This is important for it to work properly. Remember that whatever additional blur you add on the low layer will be subtracted from the new mid layer in apply image. So your additional blur cannot spread outside the boundaries of the previous blurred edges. For example, if I use Gaussian blur over it, the blur spreads even more. And this will create halos and ghost images when adjusting our frequency sliders. And our separation will become practically useless. So to blur within the already blurred edges, you can either go for surface blur or median. And by the way, for those who prefer dust and scratches over median, this might come as a surprise. If you use dust and scratches with the threshold set to 0, then the radius setting gives the exact same blur effect as median. It's the same algorithm. Try it out and see for yourself. Anyway, I'll go for surface blur because it has very defined accented edges that you can control with the threshold slider. Depending on the radius you set for the blur, you can use the preview to check what features change with the mid frequency and what changes with the low. Usually, radius of around 30 to 60 pixels with a threshold of 15 works well. Now let's go back to the mid layer and make sure the high layer visibility is turned off. Then go to image and apply image. Now we'll choose the low layer and subtract it from the mid layer. So let's click OK and change the blend mode to linear light. And now we have the high, mid and low frequency on the individual layers. And you can adjust the mid frequency using the opacity slider. But let's not stop here. Now I've taken this concept further and split the image into 5 bands of frequency. I've also created an action for it called the Frequency Separation 5, which you can download for free along with the Frequency Separation 3 from the link in the description below. And in my Photoshop, I've linked the Frequency Separation 5 action to the B2 button on my Pro Workflow panel. Once you run the action, just like before, you have to set the blur to extract the high layer. I'll keep it at 10. Next, the action will create 2 mid-frequency layers. The first, you can choose around 30 pixels of surface blur. And for the next lower mid-frequency layer, you can go up to 90 or more depending on your image. Make sure to check the preview that the blur doesn't spread out of the previously blurred edges. Once done, what this will allow you to do is to use the opacity sliders of the mid and lower mid-frequency layers to fine-tune the overall image. I usually remove the mid-frequency layer opacity completely. and then adjust the lower mid frequency. Take a look at how clean these black paper shapes look after removing the bumpy mid frequencies. This technique can also be called as band stop, as it stops some bands of mid frequencies to pass through. So basically, the mid frequency, which is nothing but the mid-tone contrast, adds a lot of harshness to the image, as it is the same intensity all across the image competing for your attention. When we mask them, as artists we get total control on which area should have what intensity. Now we can do this either by using layer blend if to apply this whole effect only to the mid-tones, and then adjust the blend if how much it affects the mid-tones. The other way of course is to create a group mask and make the mid frequency selectively appear only on important areas to make them stand out. I'm using the same concept of painting with light, color and contrast as I showed in the Make Your Portrait Pop video. If you haven't watched it, make sure to check it out after this, as it is packed with many hidden tips and tricks you may not know. So this is the before, where all the mid-tone contrast is competing to grab your attention, and this is the after. And you can see how your eyes are drawn to the subject's eyes and lips because the mid-tone contrast from the surroundings have been evened out. Most of the times people use frequency separation to work on skin, and one big reason it looks fake or overdone is because the mid frequencies of the rest of the image is at full intensity, making the skin look extra smooth and unbalanced. So this should help you balance the whole image with the help of masking. Now, you can also use standard frequency separation retouching techniques with this. So you can work directly on individual layers or create additional layers in between and retouch on it. For example, on the low layer, you can create a selection, feather it, and then use Gaussian blur to smooth out the transitions. Or you can also use the mixer brush tool in certain areas to blend color transitions. And on the high layer, you can use the healing brush or the patch tool to replace texture. Or make a selection and press Shift Delete to use Content Aware Fill to automatically generate texture in some areas. This technique can be a great help when fighting blotchy or discolored skin, like in the underarms or knees or elbow joints. And in the end, you can control the lower mid-frequency layer opacity to fine-tune. The benefit of frequency separation 3 or 5 is that it gives you mid-frequency controls in addition to the regular frequency separation retouching techniques you're used to. And of course, besides skin, this can be used in a variety of retouching scenarios like fabrics, products, car, landscapes, and architecture. Now, all this was just an introduction to the multi-split frequency concept. In the future videos, I'll show you how to apply this powerful technique in real-world retouching. So make sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified. So download the actions from down below, experiment with them, and let me know in the comments if you come up with something interesting. So I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.